Hi guys, hi, how's it going? How you doing today? Hopefully today finds you well. Today I am doing 20 worst palettes from 20 brands in 20 minutes, or as close to 20 minutes as I can get, I hope. I am a talker though, so I like to talk. So we're gonna see how quickly I go from here. I hope that sounds like something that you're interested in. I recently saw Steph from It's Just Steph do this, and I was like, I need to do this again. It has been literally 4 years since I did this video, and I'm so excited to go through it again because I have some different palettes to share with you for sure. Since 4 years ago, obviously my opinions have changed. With that said, for those of you new here, hi, my name is Donna. I'm a lover of all things high and colorful beauty and self-care. I also work in the beauty industry as a field leader for Ulta Beauty. I get a lot of education in my position. I like to bring you that education, but ultimately I'm just out here talking about makeup because I like to talk about makeup. So, assuming you're here because you also like to talk about makeup, let's just jump in. Let's just talk about the makeup. All right, so starting right now, we're going to talk through 20 palettes from 20 brands in 20 minutes that are the worst from these brands. With that said, because they're the worst from these brands, I don't have a lot of them. Some of them I went back into my declutter bin and pulled out. Some of them are still in my collection, but I'll be showing you some pictures of a lot of them because I don't have them anymore in my collection. First, let's start with Melt. This might not come as a surprise to many of you because I just reviewed this palette. This Melt Millennial Pinks was quite possibly, like, listen, Melt is not a great formula for a lot of people in the first place. I can get almost anything to work though, and I love Melt's formula, as fickle as it can be. I love Melt's formula. This, I absolutely hated this palette. It was quite possibly the worst palette. Has some really poor performing shadows in it. The shimmers were not amazing. It didn't speak to itself, and it just didn't perform. So, worst palette from Melt would be Melt Millennial Pinks. The Tarte Maneater After Dark. Like, look, I know that a lot of people talked about this palette and fell in love with this palette and talked about how it was probably Tarte's best palette on the planet. I think that they were just blinded by the fact that this is not a palette that you would typically see from Tarte, and that's it. There are some good shimmers in here. The shimmer quality in this does look a little bit different than normal Tarte shimmer quality for the most part, but this is not a great palette. It fell out all over the place. It didn't stay on my eyes in the way that regular Tarte shadows do. It was just not a great palette. So in my humble opinion, that is the worst one from Tarte. You gotta be inclusive. You just gotta be inclusive. She is my favorite. But when it comes to a worst palette from her, I would say it was the Natasha Denona Circle Loco. And I think when this came out, we were all mind blown that this was the color story that she was coming out with in this palette. And while I think that this is a beautiful palette that can be integrated into many different eye looks, the shimmers in this palette are not Natasha Denona quality shimmers in my humble opinion. They do crease quite a bit, and the color story just didn't play well with itself. A lot of people would look at this and say it's not a standalone palette in the first place. I beg to differ. I could make this a standalone palette for sure, but it just wasn't the Natasha Denona quality that I have fallen in love with. This is the Nomad Cosmetics Berlin Untergrund. Listen, this was my first Nomad Cosmetics palette, and I think had this been like my third or fourth, and I had tried many other Nomad Cosmetics palettes prior to this point, I might be interested in trying more. But because this was my first Nomad Cosmetics palette, a lot of the shadows in here are a little bit more of a satiny quality than they are like a straight up matte or a straight up shimmer. I did not fall in love with this palette. I do think that it's got some good standout shades in it, but I also think that for the most part, this palette it just is very dirty, grungy. Grungy I love, but it looks very industrial and dirty on my eyes instead of like beautiful grungy on my eyes, if that makes any sense. I didn't have fun with this palette. I wouldn't recommend this palette. And because this was my first, experience with Nomad, it left me not even wanting to try anything else from Nomad. Now, my friend Anna says that she believes that their newest palette, their Ghost Town palette, is a new formula. That might pique my interest into like potentially grabbing something else from them. I did end up getting a whole nother palette from them, the Cartagena Mágica. I think that's how you say it. And I really do quite love that palette. But other than that, like, I would have to say that that Berlin Unterground, in my humble opinion, didn't do Nomad any favors. ABH Prism for me is, a palette that I was so excited for because the color story is just a little bit unique and it's got that fluorescent yellow in it and it had this beautiful like multi-tone shade in it and this beautiful multi-tone shade in it. And honestly, every shadow in this palette is pretty much crap. I think that Obsidian is a really great black. Lure is a really great, like, just balancing out shade, or, one even to put into the crease to start off an eye look. I just don't think that this palette speaks to itself. Most of ABH palettes are standalone palettes. This one can absolutely not be a standalone palette in my humble opinion. And the shimmers in here are awful. The mattes in here are awful. I just think that this palette is awful. A lot of the shimmers in this palette get hard pan like no other, so this would be my worst from ABH. These Fenty Snap shadows, worst eyeshadow formula. And you guys will see that these look barely used. I did a palette roulette on these and very promptly put them into the declutter lens in my mind so that I would declutter them at the end of the year in my palette declutters. These did not stay in an eye look for nothing. They blended out horribly. They just blended away to nothing, let's be honest. The shimmers caused all kinds of creasing. They looked very crepey on the eyelids. They did not do you any favors. They exacerbated every amount of texture that you had, and they just didn't stay for anything. The pigmentation was awful. Yeah, horrible. I love Fenty as a brand. Hated that. Huda's Purple Haze Obsession. This one was awful. This purple being the deepest in here was a beautiful purple when it wanted to work. They're very dry and powdery and they don't go on very well, don't stay on very well. The shimmers were more like satins, which is not what we're accustomed to from Huda Beauty. It just was not a great palette, and the lighter tones were really, really light, but these two also, as different as they look in this palette, looked exactly the same. I think it was these two looked exactly the same in an eye look. There was just a lot of what I felt like was dry, folly outy, all over the place, didn't show up in an eye look kind of eyeshadow in this palette. It just wasn't the same kind of experience that I had had with Obsession's palettes in the past. The Obsession's palettes are a little bit more like inconsistent than her bigger holiday vibes palettes, but that one by far was the worst. Like when it says haze, it truly meant haze. It's just kind of a wash of color. The next one I have is by Persona, and this was my first deep dive into Persona. I hated this palette so much. I think that you guys can see it's barely used. The shimmers just feel super dry. I struggled to get anything out of this that I wanted, and I felt like, honestly, it just didn't have the caliber of shadows that I need. Pretty shadows, very, very pigmented shadows. It just didn't have anything that went together, honestly. Like, this is a matte, this is a matte, this is a matte, and this is a matte. Oh, and this black is matte. But everything else is really just kind of doesn't speak to each other in the way it should for a palette. The shades are also really super dry, so I felt like even the shimmers in the palette exacerbated texture in a way that made my eyes look really, really, really old. And also they have like this blackened base, so at the end of the day, when the shimmer has worn off the eye, you're just left with this really ugly, grungy shadow, like even down into the inner corners of your eye look that's just kind of this like black shadow. It's just not pretty. They were just dry and flaking off your lid space all the time. So I just didn't like that. Then I have this one from Juvia's Place. This is the Juvia's Place Afrique. And this one, I just feel like this palette could have been so much better because the mattes in this are all like primary colors. I felt like this was the most disjointed eyeshadow palette that I have from Juvia's Place and would consider this to be the worst. I think that I loved this shadow here, but also this one, the shimmers felt just super thick, and they also looked thick on the eyes and felt heavy. And as far as the mattes went, like they feel good and they're pigmented, but they're super chalky and patchy. And I think that you can see that. And I think a lot of it is because they are primary. Look at how patchy that is. They're primary colors that had too much, I don't know, white base in them to make them primary, and therefore became chalky patchy messes. Let's talk about Dominique Cosmetics Rustic Glam. Listen, this was a beautiful eyeshadow palette and I really wanted to love it. I have a couple of her palettes that I really actually quite love, but number one, she doesn't have my favorite formula to begin with, but man, when she tried blues, that was just not it. It was a beautiful palette that by all intents and purposes should have been like one of my favorites. Very colorful. It had a really pretty green shimmer in it that was kind of like this antique green. Really beautiful palette, but it was just the worst. It was also very patchy. It was really hard to work with. Her blues did not blend out very well at all. Just a really awful eyeshadow palette. I wanted to hold on to it for two of the shimmers and two of the shimmers alone, but I just could not. The Colored Rain Juicy Boost. I ended up getting the one that was very book-like, so it was like kind of the pastellies on one side and then the deeper ones on the other side. These shadows in this palette, number one, it only had 3 shimmers in it, and those 3 shimmers were the worst shimmers ever. They felt like not even pressed glitters, but like you could dig down into like creamy glitters in this palette. They were awful, chunky, exacerbated every amount of texture on your eye space and irritated my eyes so bad. The pastel shades in this palette were very white based, super hard to use, felt really grippy in the pan. As a matter of fact, all of them felt really grippy in the pan, which they were pressed pigments for the most part, so that's not surprising to me. But when I am a person who can get almost anything to work and could not get this palette to work, it was rough for me. I wanted to love this palette so much. The color story seemed so up my alley. I'm not a pastel person, but the pastels that it had were really like bright and vivid pastels. And then the deeper tones and the more vivid brights in this palette. I was so excited for this release, and then I got it and it just didn't work. The pastels were too white based and the deep colors were so saturated that you couldn't do anything with them. The next one is the Urban Decay Full Spectrum, and honestly, I loved this palette when I was first starting out with color because you had to blend and pack and blend and pack and blend and pack. And for somebody first starting out, that was an easy palette to use for color because it wasn't like straight up color in your face. You actually had to pack so much on it to get color in your eye look. As I like got more accustomed to Urban Decay and other eyeshadows, in the space, like I realized just how really crappy those eyeshadows were. And I ended up giving this palette to my daughter. It just didn't work. Like at the end of the day, I could have probably hit pan in one of those eyeshadows trying to do just one eyeshadow look because of how much you had to dip into a shadow to get any kind of pigmentation on your eyes. I think a lot of the shimmers in that palette reminded me so much of like a matte with a shimmer in it than they did an actual shimmer. And honestly, I don't love Urban Decay Naked formula, and that palette reminds me a lot of the Urban Decay Naked formula. I don't know what it is about that palette, but it was bad. Who remembers the Smashbox cover shots? I had a Cabana, and then I had another one that was, I can't remember what the name of it was, but it had like a black and like a burgundy in it. So pretty. They were so cool too because they had the first time I had ever seen like those, what are those called? Whatever they're called. The kinds of palettes where the cover on it changes when you move them. You'll tell me down in the comment section, I'm sure. Beautiful palettes. They were super small, but they had like 8 shadows in them so that you were able to take a full palette with you out on the road. And I thought they were going to be amazing. They were so bad. They were so bad. The color didn't stay on your eyes. They didn't blend for nothing. The shadows were dry. They were really bad. And I love Smashbox. I had 2 Smashbox palettes I absolutely loved. So when I bought these cover shots, I really did think that I was going to love them, and they were just not. For Winky Lux, listen, I got Winky Lux for the first time in a BoxyCharm and actually kind of fell in love with it. It's the Winky Lux Kitten palette. Really great palette, really nice palette to be honest, but this Galaxy Kitten palette was the absolute worst. It's like grayscales. This palette was awful. It did not blend well. It all looked the same on the eye. There was 9 shadows that were not great, not dry, but it also had a lot of like sparkle in matte shades, and because that sparkle in matte shades sometimes creates kind of blendability issues, that's what it was doing. It was just not great, and it fell out all over the place, which isn't a deal breaker for me most of the time, but it fell out all over the place and then was hard also to clean up. I would get like black shadow everywhere all day long. The next one I have is the BH Cosmetics Take Me Back to Brazil, which was neons, and it was horrible. The pans in this palette were the size of a dime, so getting your brush into them was so hard. But these neons were like so, I don't know. I don't know what it is about them. Were they saturated? Were they white based? Whatever it was that was going on with this palette made it so that these shadows blended away to absolutely nothing. You were left with the dullest, almost pastel looking shadow on your eye when you're looking at a very vibrant, very pigmented, very like fluorescent eyeshadow palette. I was so excited about this eyeshadow palette. I had just tried BH for, I think, the first time with the Zodiac palette and was in love with those shadows. But now that I'm remembering correctly, like with the Zodiac palette, I didn't love the mattes in that palette, so that should have told me that buying an all matte for the most part neon eyeshadow palette was a bad idea, but that's where I'm at. I really do. I have a ton of BH still in my collection. That one was by far the worst, and it did go into my declutter. Elf Mad for Matte. Who remembers this? Like 10 pans, looking like the Urban Decay Naked palettes. Really pretty color story. Awful eyeshadows. And that was one of my first experiences with drugstore eyeshadows, and might be why I have a hard time with drugstore eyeshadows these days. But this palette was actually really pretty. I wanted to love this palette so dang much, but it was awful. What are you going to get though for like a $3 eyeshadow palette, which is what I think I paid for this eyeshadow palette? I should have known better. I guess not horrible. But when I look at like the little tiny elf like ones with the 4 shadows in them, whatever those are called. I can't, snack size or whatever they're called, bite size. When I look at the quality of those versus that e.l.f. Mad for Matte, I'm like, those were so much better quality. I don't have any of those left in my collection either, but those were so much better quality than that Mad for Matte one was. I don't know what's up with that one. And then we have the Aether Beauty Moonlight Crystal. You guys, I got this in a BoxyCharm, and I had heard great things about Aether Beauty. These shadows were quite possibly the worst shadows I've ever tried to put onto my lid space. 90% of them were shimmers in this palette. The shimmers in this palette functioned more like a satin and not a shimmer. So there was no sparkliness, no like eye catchiness to them, but they also were so thick. Again, with the thick satiny shadow, like I just don't understand why they had to be that thick. They created all kinds of texture on my eyelid. And in addition to that, I don't feel like any of the shadows in this palette looked like they should have according to what they looked like in the pan. So they definitely weren't true to pan in application. They did not blend well. They did not pack well. They did not, and they fell out all over my face all throughout the day because they were so thick. And I'm not talking like fallout. I'm talking like chunks of pieces of eyeshadow. Like, and I'm not putting like chunks of eyeshadow onto my eyes. So I don't know where it was all coming from, but it was not good. It made it so that I didn't want to purchase anything else from Aether Beauty. So it's wild to me that there are so many people on this platform that love Aether Beauty. Like, did I get a dud? Who knows? But now we'll never know because Aether's out of business anyways. When I was going back into like my deep down thought processes, I was like, oh my God, I can't even fathom I remember this as well as I do. But the NYX Machinist palette, it was like steampunk, like on the cover. Well, that steampunk cover drew me in. I put that palette onto my eyes, and you know, as much as I say that Nomad Cosmetics Untergrund palette just looked industrial and dirty on my face, that Machinist palette looked industrial and dirty on my face. And what's sad about that is it had, I think, like a purple, and it had like a yellow and a red, but it just looked ugly on my face. I was so disappointed with that palette. There were actually, I think, like 3 in that like collection, and I was gonna grab all 3, and I was so glad after having reviewed that palette that I had not grabbed the other ones because that one was awful. It looked so bad on my face. The next one I have is the Too Faced Gingerbread Extra Spicy. I was peer pressured into this palette by my daughter. We were at TJ Maxx, and I'm not a fan of Too Faced. I think I have 3 Too Faced palettes in my collection, or 4. And they're truly the best of the best from Too Faced, to be honest. Too Faced is not a brand that I even side-eye anymore. This Too Faced Gingerbread Extra Spicy, I've never bought a holiday palette from them, and my daughter was like, ooh, you should buy this. This is super pretty. And it was super pretty, but it performed like poop. The shimmers in those, no sparkle, no oomph, no in your face, no like draws you in kind of shimmerness to it. The mattes were just whatever. They're just whatever mattes. I mean, it wasn't like horrible in performance, but it wasn't great in performance. Of all the Too Faced palettes that I think of through the lens of those holiday palettes, the gingerbread, the pumpkin spice, the whatevers, that one was by far the worst. And the last one is the ColourPop Garden Variety. I get suckered in by packaging sometimes, and the packaging on this one was beautiful. Really pretty, like sage greens and purples and lilacs, and just really pretty packaging with the succulents and all the beautifulness. And then I got it home. It sat in my collection for quite some time before I used it. But then when I finally did, I was like, I might have as well have picked up like an invisible eyeshadow palette. Like none of the colors in that palette showed up on my skin. And I thought, what in the hell? Like, why are none of these colors showing up? Because they weren't necessarily pastels. I mean, they were on the pastel spectrum, but not, if that makes any sense. And the shimmers were just doldrum. I don't know what I was thinking. It was only like, I don't have a whole lot from ColourPop, but the palettes that I do have from ColourPop are amazing. Amazing. And I remember buying singles from ColourPop way back in the day, and they were so good. And I have Super Shocks from ColourPop that are so good. This palette was awful. The glitters inside of it also, I think every single shimmer in that palette was more of a matte with glitter in it than it was a shimmer. And again, they just were, there was just nothing special about the palette, and the performance was just non-existent. Like I said, I might as well have had 20 invisible shades in my hand, or 18 or 15, whatever, however many were in the palette. I think there were 18 invisible shadows. So with that said, I do know that I took way longer than 20 minutes, but I'm hoping that y'all enjoyed this video. I will have a 20 best from 20 brands in quasi 20 minutes, because I don't like every video that I put out to have a little bit negative and, you know, connotation to it. I don't like negative videos, period, for the most part. I do still have several of these palettes in my collection because I refuse to let them go. I refuse to give up. But yeah, those were the 20 worst palettes from 20 brands in quasi 20 minutes, in my humble opinion. And I hope that you guys enjoyed it. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. I hope that you enjoyed the video. Let me know what your 20 worst from 20 brands would be, or, you know, 5 worst from 5 brands would be. Don't forget to hit me up down in the comments section, you guys. I really would love to hear your thoughts and opinions on this. I hope that you and yours are well, that you are all healthy and safe and staying sane in this crazy world, and that you are all loving each other, but loving each other from afar. And until next time. Bye, friends.